Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Oregon Trade Summit. I'm Angela Wilhelms, President and CEO of Oregon Business and Industry. OBI is your statewide chamber of commerce, as well as Oregon's affiliate for the National Association of Manufacturers and the National Retail Federation. We engage in advocacy, education, and research, all with an eye toward improving the state's business climate and ultimately creating a healthier, more prosperous, and more competitive economy. So it's our pleasure to have organized today's event, but we could not do it without the help of our event sponsors, the Port of Portland and the Portland Metro Chamber. Thank you to both of them for engaging in this event and this discussion. Before I get started with an overview of today, I want to take care of a few housekeeping notes. Thank you for your grace as we pivoted to an online event from an in-person one. This new platform allows us to open the event up to a far wider geography, and given the importance of trade across the state, that is an important thing for us to be able to do. So thank you for that and for joining us from all parts of the state of Oregon. This event is being recorded, and we'll post that recording on our site so that you can share it with others in your networks. And as we go, our team will provide useful links in the chat feature, so please be aware of those as they come through. Finally, also as we go, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you have of our speakers or our panelists. We'll do our best to get to all of them and can follow up if we don't make it. So why are we here today? Well, as you all know, by virtue of participating, trade is a critical piece of Oregon's economy. It impacts businesses small and large, rural and urban, young and old, and from a variety of sectors. So foremost, it's important that we talk about it, that we ensure our business community and our elected and appointed policymakers are aware of the role that trade plays in the daily lives of Oregonians and in the state's overall economic health. Raising awareness about the magnitude of traded sector activity in Oregon is an imperative if we want to ensure policies align with leveraging the strengths we have in the state and increasing and growing our economic output. But beyond that general discussion and education, we are, of course, right now facing an extraordinary time when it comes to the national and international dialogue around trade. This is largely driven by the conversation around tariffs, but infrastructure, container ship fees, nationalism in partner countries, and our other issues swirling around us today also affect our traded sector industries. Increased tariffs, shifting proposals, emerging negotiations, now multiple lawsuits, including one filed by our own Attorney General here in Oregon, those all factor into a daily, frankly, probably more frequent information cycle. And sometimes that flow of information has its own recourse, even outside of policy setting. All of this matters to businesses across Oregon. These businesses need to understand what they can do, how they can plan to be resilient in the face of new and evolving information. As you all know, businesses are not a monolith. We often have to remind people of that here at OBI. How and to what extent emerging trade policy, particularly tariffs, impact varies wildly across companies and sectors. It's also important that at the state level, while we seek to understand and grapple with changing federal policy, that we don't lose sight of what's happening here and what's happening on the ground in Oregon that impacts our relative competitiveness, or frankly, lack thereof. This is also something we talk a lot about at OBI. So coming together across sectors to share collective knowledge and support for one another as we plan for, quote, what's next in this conversation is critical to our overall economic well-being. So with that in mind, we have 3 goals for today, all of which feed to a primary goal of that education and awareness. First, understand trade's true impact on Oregon's economy through updated data about our partners, key sectors, and more. Second, provide an update about the now current at least, and of course fluid and evolving federal trade and tariff policy landscape. And third, to understand the implications of this information on businesses across Oregon and the sectors in which they operate. We cannot possibly cover everything in one event. So while this is the first Oregon Trade Summit, we do not expect it to be the last. Today is a first step in right-sizing information about trade's impact in the state and providing timely information. We'll continue to do that both for the business community and our elected and appointed policymakers as these conversations evolve. In addition, the Portland Metro Chamber's annual Washington, D.C. fly-in, event which OBI is proud to be a community partner for, is next week. So we'll be taking feedback we get from you today through questions, comments, etc., and incorporating that into the discussions we have with federal policymakers and leaders next week. Again, as you have questions or even just comments you want to share, please use that Q&A function. We'll endeavor to answer them and we'll capture comments for our work overall. So with that, let's get started with our first presentation of the day. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Curtis Robinhold, Executive Director of the Port of Portland. Curtis.
Great. Thanks, Angela. Hi, everybody. A real privilege to be with you here today. Angela, thanks to you and the OBI team for getting us all together. A really important conversation about trade. I think, as people know, the Port of Portland's mission is to build shared prosperity through travel, trade, and economic development. And we do that in a lot of different ways, owning big facilities like PDX and 5 business parks. We own more industrial land than anyone in the state of Oregon. We run Oregon's only international container terminal currently operating, and other terminals on bulk, wheat, corn, but also moving large construction equipment, automobile imports and exports. And finally, we are responsible for maintaining the Columbia River, so it's deep and wide enough for ships and barges carrying goods in and out of Oregon. So trade really matters to us, whether it's cherry growers in the Gorge or foresters in the Willamette Valley, Nike designing products that are coming this way, but also leaving as air soles, semiconductor manufacturers, restaurant owners, everyone connected to trade in Oregon, it turns out, is most everyone, which is why we're really looking forward to hearing more from ECONorthwest today. Back in 2019, Angela referenced a bit that we, together with some partners, including Portland Metro Chamber and the Pacific Northwest International Trade Association, PNETA, sponsored a report called The Value of Jobs. And at the time, it was the first time we really took a look as a group at Oregon's state of trade. And with all the shifts happening, many of which were referenced by Angela at the federal level this year, we decided it was a good time to work with ECONorthwest on an update. And I really think the findings and analysis you're going to hear are fundamental to understanding how trade policy affects the state, how it impacts businesses and workers and residents, and how we might navigate this changing landscape going forward. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Michael Wilkerson. Mike is a leading expert and thought partner in economics. He's a partner and director of economic research at ECONorthwest, and he's got 20 years of experience working with public sector and private clients around the country. Mike is interestingly also an adjunct professor in the Master of Real Estate Development program up at PSU. And he's really got this unique intersection of real estate and economic development, really thinking with a goal of creating effective policies and influencing the built environment, things that we at the Port are also interested in. So with that, let me hand it off to Mike Wilkerson. Mike, you ready to go?
I am. Thank you for that introduction, Curtis. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think as Curtis mentioned, we every couple of years take a look at the importance of trade in Oregon, and what we consistently find is, I think what everyone who lives in this region understands is, we are at a critical hub as it relates geographically, and that's a great benefit to the region and frankly to the national economy. And I think this is an opportune time to take a deeper dive and a look to really start to quantify what has changed in the last several years, and certainly what this moment in time looks like, which if the word of the year during the pandemic was unprecedented, I think we're swapping that in now for the word around uncertain. And so you will probably hear me say uncertain and uncertainty many times over today. But I think, I just want to thank the various partners and sponsors to help facilitate this study. Certainly, OBI, Portland Metro Chamber, OBC, GPI, Intel, and the Port of Portland have all been fabulous partners in helping help spotlight the importance of trade, and certainly many of those contribute to that in the region. So with that, I will start sharing my screen. We can hop in here, and I believe questions should be directed to the chat. There'll be an opportunity afterwards to spend some time unpacking any potential Q&A. So with that, as Curtis mentioned, jobs, I think, is one of those first things that we can start at in quantifying the importance of trade. And so this looks at effectively imports, exports, the direct impacts, and all those downstream supply chain, and then the consumer spending impacts as well. And we wrap all that up, what we see is more than 270,000 jobs in the state are touched by trade. That's about 1 out of 8 jobs statewide in terms of the scope. In terms of what trade means, certainly there's been a lot of emphasis nationally around our trade deficit, which is to say nationally we export less than we import. But that is made up of many different industries and geographies. And if we unpack what's going on nationally, what we'll find is most states import more than they export, with the notable exception of the 11 states that you see listed here, Oregon being one of them, where these 11 states actually export more than they import. And so that is to say they're positively contributing to the trade balance, whereas all the other states are having the opposite effect. So we'll start to unpack why this matters and why this is pretty unique to Oregon. If we look at what that specifically means, we export in the last year $5.8 billion more in goods than we imported during that same calendar year. And there are only 2 states that contribute more to a surplus, and those are Texas and Louisiana. And what's notable about those economies and what they export is those are largely natural resource extraction. So think petroleum, oil products, et cetera. And Oregon is very unique in that we aren't necessarily at that same level of resource extraction. We're much more into high value add manufacturing, as well as some agriculture and timber and other products that we support. So we are a much more diversified contributor to the overall trade surplus in the sense of the 11 states that are contributing. In terms of quantity and importance to the economy, if we look at the goods that we're exporting, they are 11% of our state GDP. That puts us as the 6th highest state. So again, I think not only are we positively contributing, trade is almost more important here as it relates to the strength of our economy than in any other state. And this has been true for many years over. So if we look at the chart on the left, we're consistently hovering around 11% in terms of what goods are contributing to that. The map on the right shows you again that distribution. You can certainly see Texas and Louisiana are there as well in terms of high shares of GDP that are related specifically to exports. The states that we're comparing ourselves to on the chart are kind of some of our peer regions that we historically use in working with the Portland Metro Chamber. So Washington State's share of importance has declined. Other states have generally declined, albeit more slowly, whereas Oregon has been consistent and maybe even on slight uptick in the last several years. In terms of impacts to households, I think this is certainly a topic that's front and center, and we'll unpack this a little bit more. Understanding the various tariff regimes is very challenging, and so what we're using here is a source from Yale University. It's the Budget Lab. They track things on a daily basis effectively, and so they're tracking these things through, let's say, early last week is the latest update that they've pushed through. What those estimates suggest is an average household might see an increase of about $3,800 in terms of inflation effectively, or cost of household expenditures going up in a calendar year in which those tariffs are fully absorbed. So with that intro, we'll spend some time unpacking exports and imports, a little bit on the benefits to trade, and then to the extent we can contextualize what's happening in terms of tariffs and trade war risks to the state. So on the import front, I think a surprise to no one is that semiconductors are our most valuable export. They are, in fact, twice as valuable as our next largest category of import, and this has been fairly consistent over time. What hasn't been consistent is the destination of our exports. And so when we look back to 2018, pre-pandemic, China was our largest destination of imports. Today, that is Mexico. If we go back even to 2010, Mexico was our 15th largest trading partner. And so when we're consistently looking at top 10 trading partners, Mexico was not on that list. And today, that is very different. We also see an increase in prominence in Malaysia and in Vietnam. And in Ireland, and it should come as no surprise that the reason for that is largely due to semiconductors. Mexico, however, is not due to semiconductors. And if we look at what is growing in Mexico, it is exponential growth as it relates to the transportation sector. So these can be effectively motor vehicle parts, and other engines and other transmission equipment. That is to say, we are largely exporting some finished vehicles, but also parts that are used in an international integrated value add. And so this is very different components than we see in some other trading partners. In terms of the breadth of what is exported across the state, we are, I would say, pretty unique in that we are both high value add production and manufacturing, as well as having strength in commodity. And you can see this difference when we look at the value of our exports as the orange bar versus the blue bar are the share of volume for those exports. And you can really see here places like Japan, South Korea, where the volume is much higher than the value. That's where largely our commodities and our ag are focused versus, say, Mexico or Malaysia or Vietnam, where the share of the value is much higher. And this is where we're seeing a higher quantity of semiconductors, largely resulting for that explanation. In terms of how our destination for semiconductors has changed, this was once certainly China at the forefront. Today, we are seeing a much more reliance on Malaysia, Vietnam, even Israel in terms of the destination of our exports. So while China is still the largest, its overall share is declining. So that's a quick touch on the exports. Important to us is also imports because what we export is oftentimes reliant on international trade. And this is, again, very different than the structure of many economies that are natural resource extractive or agricultural based. That is to say, they are entirely domestically sourced. A lot of our imports are reliant on supply chains that are international in scope. And so from a trade perspective, and certainly when we start talking about trade wars, that places more risk to our state than we see in most any other state around the country. In terms of the trading partners, Japan has consistently been our largest trading partner. It continues to be so. This is much less reliant on inputs in terms of intermediate and raw goods. This is more around vehicles that are finished at the port as a destination for that. But when we look at some of our other sources and trading partners, we can see an increased in terms of share in Taiwan. And again, this is a lot of substitution from China into Taiwan and other places as it relates to inputs into semiconductors or various stages of production that are explaining that difference. Similarly to what we see in the pattern of exports, we are importing both intermediate goods and raw goods in terms of largely targeting value add production. And so whether these are computers and electronic parts or non-metallic and other minerals or wood products, et cetera, we can see there's a broad range of what we're importing in terms of its share of value versus its share of volume across the board. And again, this is because of the structure of Oregon's economy being both high value add as well as some commodities that we're exporting. So that's a quick touch on imports and exports. In terms of the benefits to trade, certainly we talked about jobs, and 1 in 8 jobs statewide are in industries that are touching trade in one way or another. What's important to note is this is not specific to the Portland Metro or the Willamette Valley. We see the impact of trade flowing across all counties across the state, so much so that many of our highest concentrations in terms of jobs are found outside of the Portland Metro. But again, we're seeing statewide quite a bit of distribution in terms of where the extent of trade touches. In terms of another benefit of trade is we on average see about 12% higher wages for workers that are working in industries that are largely trade dependent. There's a wide range here from ag and crop production certainly being a little bit below the statewide average to computers and semiconductors. And we have done a number of studies recently looking at that industry and manufacturing in general and see the wage premiums associated with those high value add production industries. Oregon is largely a place of small business. So I think what we can see here is, again, in trade that holds true. If we look at the number of firms that are engaged in trade, 88% of them employ less than 500 people. And certainly when we look at the impacts of trade, this is not to say that small businesses or large industries are going to see different impacts. This is just to note that this is an important part of trade across the state in terms of location, in terms of industry, and also size of firm. So the last section we're going to talk about is tariffs and the trade wars. And again, here there's immense uncertainty about what will actually be implemented, how that will change. And so to the extent that we can, this is what we're able to quantify in the moment in time, which is the proposed tariff regime would be the highest we have seen since prior to World War II. And again, the nature of the how quickly they have been proposed is certainly unprecedented in terms of its communications. We've talked about the impact to households on average of being $3,800. Tariffs, because of how they impact household expenditures, are very regressive in nature. And so what that means is the impact to disposable income for lowest income households could be as high as 4%. Or $1,700 in an average year, versus when we look at the highest income households, their share of their disposable income is less, even though their dollar amount is highest. So again, noting that tariffs in a way act similarly to a sales tax, which is to say they are regressive in nature. What that means in terms of overall cost increases, I think, is challenging because the numbers associated with tariffs being in the 10 to 25 and certainly much higher than that percentage doesn't necessarily translate into the average cost of goods. And so what these models are showing in the short run is something like a slightly higher than 2%, 2.3% overall price impact. But that varies greatly by commodity, and certainly those commodities that are domestically produced versus imports. And we're seeing a larger share of that on imports. And so what this is suggesting is there would be some measure of substitution away from imported products subject to high tariffs. And that, again, is part of the overall equation in terms of what specifically tariffs would do in terms of consumer behavior. What we see, though, is apparel and leather products being the most impacted here, into things like vehicles at around 8.5%. And then we get into some other products in terms of wood, fruits, vegetables, et cetera, in that lower range. But if we look at the overall market basket of what a consumer would consume, that would be about a 2.3% increase based on what we know. Not only do they impact consumers, certainly they impact business, and there is a strong connection between those two in that what consumers are demanding is going to impact producers' ability to substitute input costs and locations of where products are produced. And what this looks like is effectively a very turbulent period of time in the economy for at least the next 18 months, where these models are suggestive of decreases in gross domestic product by up to 1.6%. From there, the economy starts to understand more around what those patterns are and settles into kind of the long-term impact starting in late 2028 in terms of what the overall impact would be. So again, I think this is indicative of there are short-term shocks from which are challenging to react to. And in the long run, this is suggestive of an economy that is less efficient because of these tariffs. They have looked across country, and the only country that's expected to have more of a negative outcome would be Canada. All other countries might be negatively impacted, but to a lesser extent than the US, and some countries actually might be the beneficiary of these trade regimes. So what does that mean for Oregon? I think what we see is the prominence of trade in Oregon is amongst the highest of any state, and its ability to contribute to our economy is key. Because of our high value add export-oriented manufacturing ecosystem, we are reliant on both imports of raw and intermediate materials, to export. And so the impact of tariffs is more so felt in the structure of our economy than a place that is domestically producing things that are export oriented. Again, we know this is going to impact households and businesses. We also see other impacts in terms of tourism industry, and tourism is counted as an export. And so as people from around the globe come to Oregon, that is a benefit on the service side in terms of exports. And we're seeing other federal policies that are primarily impacting certainly the volume of travelers coming in from around the country. I think in terms of the theory, we can see that a consistently communicated tariff policy with a long phase-in period can promote some import substitution and reshoring. I think we can look at Mexico in the sense of its trajectory with Oregon post USMCA with an increased reliance on that transportation sector as an example of what a long phase-in communicated strategy can do. The structure of the economy has the ability to adapt and change, and we can see that as a long-term benefit to Oregon. Conversely, when we have policies that are uncertain, immediately implemented, changed frequently, it makes investments particularly challenging. And what that likely does is increase costs in the short run of production, coupled with a decreased demand from consumers. And that is particularly challenging to navigate for businesses. So I think as Oregon seeks to preserve economic momentum, understanding these implications as it relates to countries and specific commodities. So for example, semiconductors today are excluded. Changing the semiconductor exclusion would have broad-reaching impacts that would would disproportionately impact Oregon over any other state. So that is crucial to understand as we're thinking about navigating future risks, as well as those vulnerabilities that they present to a thriving Oregon economy. So with that, I thank you for your time and happy to take questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Mike. Let's go ahead and jump into a couple questions. We've got some from the audience. One technical one I want to get out of the way. Just I think back on slide 10, you had a list of the goods exported from Oregon. Can you clarify for some of the audience members where wood products fits into that chart?
In terms of exports?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe that would fall under the category of agricultural products. So we can go back and look at that. It's challenging when we look at trying to sync services with goods that are exported. Services are typically only reported at a national level, but we understand, particularly in Oregon, that services are an important component part. And so when we roll all that up, the levels of detail are less. We can certainly report out from a goods standpoint where wood falls in different than other agricultural products.
Great. You talked a little bit about manufacturing, so I just want to I want to go back to that for a second. One of our questions was relating to the fact that the state economist has in the recent past and as current as recent revenue forecasts talked about how we're entering a manufacturing recession, or excuse me, have entered a manufacturing recession. So can you talk a little bit more about manufacturing and how the tariff conversation may exacerbate or potentially flip that on its head a little bit, and what the already declining private sector job creation scenario in Oregon might mean even more acutely in this whole conversation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think the potential benefit of a tariff strategy when, again, deployed in predictable ways, probably in nominal amounts that are much lower with a long term, is that benefit of reshoring. And so if that's the theory around one of the benefits of tariffs, we can point to some evidence of that having happened in Oregon. But when we look at the current policy environment, I think it's much more likely to detract from what we're seeing than being a positive contributor. And so at a time where, as you mentioned, we're seeing private sector employment declines in virtually every sector across the state, manufacturing being amongst them, and we look at high value add manufacturing in Oregon being integrated into an international supply chain, the structure of our economy is going to be much more impacted than states who maybe have manufacturing but are domestically sourcing those products.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we got a question from someone. I'm going to use this opportunity to thank that individual. Andrew Hone from the Portland Metro Chamber put in a question, and I just want to again thank Andrew and the Portland Chamber for leaning into this event and also the report you mentioned on the outset, helping to get this data gathered. So thank you, PMC, for that. But Andrew's question: while our federal delegation and administration are clearly important partners in advancing trade policy, what is the role that local and state elected leaders can play in trade? And how can we create a trade supportive environment in every corner of the state?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for us, what we see in Oregon is the industries that are contributing to trade aren't isolated to one part of the state. And so understanding that in some parts of the state that is very agricultural based, whereas in other parts that is high value add manufacturing, and understanding the constraints to growth in those sectors. For example, land is one thing that we hear consistently in terms of its a limited supply impacting the ability to grow. When we start to look at, policies that can support growth, we have tools in place statewide, whether those be enterprise zones, or SIP agreements, or other things that are incentivizing capital investments into industries that are largely export important. So I think, again, at the state and local level, particularly in a state like Oregon, which is less natural resource extractive in nature, there are lots of ways in which state and local governments can impact trade.
That makes sense. The question too, what are you seeing in terms of non-tariff retaliation? So is that showing up in your data? Things like I know anecdotally we've heard a lot about Canadians, for example, canceling orders even apart from a tariff discussion. Are you seeing that in the data?
So the data we have largely pulled is through end of year 2024. And so I think we do have several months of data. What we typically find in these data is they're very choppy from month to month. And so we typically like to look at minimum to like a 3 month trailing to understand what is actually going on. So I think in the coming months, we'll have a much better sense of what that looks like. But I did mention tourism was one of those things that where we can see an immediate impact of that. And so we're seeing, and certainly Curtis and others in the port can talk about that in terms of the share of international travel, whether that's from Canada or other places that are not specifically tariff related, but more so are those non-tariff retaliatory measures that we're seeing as an early indicator that we have in the data. And I suspect we'll see more of that coming forward as we have more trade data that we can look at reliably.
Yeah, and that also, I wanted to get your opinion on that question, but that's a question we can infuse into our panel discussion later on, where Curtis will be back as a panelist, and we also have some folks from different industries who can maybe touch on that piece of it as well. When you looked at I mean, you spend a lot of time in digging around Oregon economic data from a wide variety of topics and lenses. Is there anything that really surprised you or stood out to you as you did this report?
I think the thing that was surprising to us is one, that only 11 states are positively contributing to a trade surplus. So I think from a national perspective, you can debate the merits of whether a trade surplus matters or not. But certainly, I think if that is part of the consideration and understanding that some states are massively contributing to that while most are not is the nature of the problem. And so when we're looking at Oregon contributing almost $6 billion more, the two states that are above us being natural resource extraction based, Texas actually drops below Oregon, which is shocking to think about that the value add that we produce, if you take away those industries, is second only behind Louisiana in terms of what it's contributing. And so a state like Oregon, with less than 2% of the population, has an outsized interest as it relates to trade. I think we had an intuition on that, but this report really helped quantify how truly critical Oregon is to the overall trade ecosystem nationally.
Yeah, I think that's something that does surprise a lot of people in conversations we have at OBI. People don't necessarily realize that we're a net export state. It's because it's so uncommon and because the national debate and dialogue is flipped on that axis a little bit. It sounds, based on the data that you showed, we obviously have some very strong industries that stand out above the rest, as well as strong trading partners that stand out above the rest. But overall, there's a pretty good spread of products that we're both importing and exporting. Do you think that diversification helps us in a time of uncertainty, or do you think that only adds to the possible chaos of the uncertainty?
It's a tough question. I think because of the varied nature of exclusion by commodity, exclusion by country, and changing dynamics makes it really difficult to understand in the moment what the impact would be to the state versus, um, again, industries that aren't reliant on imports as well. But generally speaking, I think this is to the benefit of Oregon because of that diversification that's going to benefit not only geographically across the state, but the ability to lean into kind of what we saw as an example in Mexico, which is when an opportunity presents itself, we can really look at that and be proactive in terms of adding to our industries that are growing, not just looking at the industries we've historically had that are trade dependent and benefiting the rest of the state.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then just as we have a couple more minutes for questions for Dr. Wilkerson, so if you have any, please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A feature. We will get to those. Hopefully we have time. We have a couple more in the queue, but want to make sure we get folks in there. As you look at the countries, the relationships that we have countries with, and the countries, excuse me, that we have the trade relationships with, and how that's shifted over time, could you glean from the data at all whether that is predominantly, and you touched on this, whether that's predominantly geopolitical or whether it's just how markets and product demands are moving, or is it a blending of the two?
Yeah, I think it's a blending of the two. I mean, I think you can look at China, in particular as historically our most important trading partner and certainly still very important. When we look at the substitution away of out of China in terms of certainly on the import side, but also on an export destination side. So I think again, having a new tariff regime imposed in the first Trump presidency that carried all the way through, but the Biden presidency is again another example of how those longer term structural changes we can see working through the economy. When people have that understanding and predictability, then that's when that substitution can occur over the long run.
And then sort of a macro level question, and again, something you sort of alluded to, but I want to unpack a little. Probably get an earful from some of my board members if I didn't at OBI unpack the following topic, which is, Oregon's trade is a national conversation. It obviously impacts states very differentially given their mix of traded products, the trade balance, the countries, et cetera, but it is a national conversation. And so, h- how does a state's relative competitiveness or business climate underlying that traded sector activity, how does that, I mean, it's kind of a leading question. Obviously, we have a perspective here at OBI, so you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. But how does that affect how a state like Oregon emerges relative to other states once maybe we do get some certainty or clarity at the federal level?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are lots of factors that go into a state's business competitiveness. And so when you're looking at whether that's taxes in specific, whether that's regulatory processes, whether that's other factors that are quality of life related, we know Oregon historically has been a net importer of talent and businesses from around the country. And we have seen that really pause and maybe even decline slightly in the last several years. And so I think this, again, is an opportunity to look at the structure of the Oregon economy and understand historically we've had some big advantages, but to not take those for granted and to really understand that uh, in a, let's say, world system that is less competing around efficiency and more contributing around political topics, that you're going to see some movements happening, and the importance to be able to understand how to compete for that smaller share of growth that's going to exist nationally and certainly around the globe, I think is an important consideration for any state to contemplate.
Well, that's great. And last one, just Dr. Wilkerson, and I know um, economists are traditionally, and you mentioned as you were looking backward at historical data as it's been filed away, but do you have any predictions as to how this is going to unfold or what 2025 is going to look like? I know it's kind of an unfair question, but I've got to ask anyway.
No, my crystal ball is usually not great, and right now it's particularly broken. I think a lot of that has to do with the magnitude of what we're talking about from a tariff policy. So we can look back at previous examples over time and we can study those relationships. I think the challenge is when you see such big moves, do those previous studies carry any water, or are those somewhat irrelevant? And I think that's the big unknown as it relates to really what we're talking about is cost incidence. And so does the tariff like a tax get absorbed by businesses? Does it get absorbed by consumers? The answer is it gets absorbed by both. And that is where that inefficiency comes in. And to the extent that businesses absorb more of that, that has less of an impact on households. I think that's what largely these models are suggestive of when you're seeing consumer price indexes at 2%. But if we saw previous examples of imposed tariffs, if those relationships held, those numbers would be much, much higher. And so again, I think there's some measure of speculation around what the impact would be to something of this size and the speed at which it's introduced. But I think if you try to get an economist's opinion on things, the answer is it changes every day as the news and everything else changes. And so it's really hard to sit there and try to understand what might happen other than, again, uncertainty or the person shrugging emoji, I feel like is something we're using a lot these days.
Yeah, that we can share that and like the squiggly, I don't know how to feel face, I think is getting used a lot today too. So, well, Mike, thank you so much for your time and for the report. This report will be online, of course. Both the Portland Chamber, OBI, and other partners will be making sure that it's released and shared for direct consumption. So thank you to you and the team for putting this together. And we'll have to continually do some updating to this as we see how things unfold over the next several quarters. Thank you
Thanks
very
for the
much.
opportunity to share today.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so we're going to switch from the Oregon view now up to the federal landscape. I'm sure that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce will be the first to say that an update today is exactly that, an update today. Tomorrow's update could be different, and so too could the day after that. But for today, April 28th, we're going to hear about the now current policy landscape at the federal level from someone who watches this very closely for U.S. Chamber of Commerce members, as well as U.S. Chamber of Commerce Federation partners like OBI. So joining us now is Isabelle Icso, Senior Director of International Policy at the U.S. Chamber, where she advocates for the Chamber's international trade and investment priorities before the administration, Congress, as well as foreign governments. And Isabelle has a tremendous background for this type of work in this type of moment. Before joining the Chamber, she was a trade and tax policy analyst with the investment firm Height Capital Market, excuse me. And she actually analyzed policy moves and their market implications. And earlier in her career, she was a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade, where she covered important issues, especially important to states like Oregon, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, as well as General Trade Promotion Authority issues. So Isabelle's a tremendous asset within the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we're fortunate to have her joining us here today to share with us the latest at the federal level. And again, if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A, and when she's done with her overview, we'll have a little bit of time for those questions. So thank you very much, Isabelle. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Angela. Good to be with you here. I resonated a little with your squiggly emoji face of doom. I think it's certainly being used here in DC as well. I just want to make sure you can see my PowerPoint if I can get a verbal affirmation.
We can't see it, Isabelle.
Okay, let's see. Aha. How's that? How about now?
There it goes. You're good.
Okay, great. Well, look, I always like to start by just kind of zooming in on Oregon so that you have some context for some of the Beltway related sort of higher level context that I provide later on. And this is something that we focused on all summer here, was really underscoring the importance of international trade and investment on a state by state level. And Oregon is in that trade actually supports about 2 in 9 total jobs in the state. Companies exported to more than 190 markets around the world. And Oregon's total goods and services exports increased by 10 billion, so about 38% in the past 10 years here. So major reliances here. The top markets are unsurprisingly Canada and Mexico, Mexico, China, and Canada. That's kind of the top 3 for most US states, quite frankly, and we'll get into that. Top goods and services exports from Oregon are computers, transportation equipment, machinery, followed by others. So I just like to start with that, so you all have that kind of in mind as we go into the president's trade agenda here. And what he's been focusing on is the need to sort of rebalance trade relationships on the basis of reciprocity. And maybe this is something that you have heard about in previous sessions as well. But that's really how he's attacking each of these goals, right? How can I get these countries to help me reduce the trade deficit they have with the US? What can I get them to sort of pony up in the meantime? And how can I demonstrate that to my base? In addition to those kinds of leverage-based talks, he's also talked about revisiting existing deals and striking new ones. These could be sectoral deals. He's talked about critical minerals and biopharma as an example here. Again, primarily as a way to decouple from China. This has been a campaign goal of his for some time now, including his first campaign, right? We at the Chamber believe more in a strategic de-risking approach with China versus a full-on decoupling. But as we said, as we'll discuss later on, this new sort of 145% tariff makes it a full-on decoupling, at least on our way to that. So he's very clear and he's very adamant about making supply chains, at least for all essential goods, 100% American. So in terms of his 100 days, right? I think this week marks his 100 days in office here. Tariffs talks in China have really been the tenets of what he and his team have been up to so far. He's imposed tariffs or will impose tariffs on roughly 3 trillion worth of US imports. He's also, in addition to kind of some of the tariffs that we've seen, we're expecting tariffs on lumber, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and as of last week, truck imports, medium to heavy truck imports. So every week is a new sort of flavor du jour here for what is going to be in need for quote unquote increased protection in the form of tariffs in his eyes. It's also been filled with a lot of talks, right? The April 2nd announcement regarding the reciprocal tariffs have led to a lot of countries coming to Washington to negotiate with the US, at least see what's on the table, see what can be done and what's in the offing in terms of any sort of agreements. And by agreements, I don't mean comprehensive trade agreements like we're used to, but more along the lines of, memorandums of understanding, quick wins that he can notch in each relationship with respect to increase defense and air purchases or LNG purchases or pledges to invest more in the US, things like that. It appears that South Korea, Japan, and India are the farthest along with the UK, but we really have little detail there. And then lastly, China, everything has been extremely escalatory with Beijing. Tariffs are closer to actually 170 if you include the 145% tariff on top of tariffs that were already in existence before that. He's also ending the long beholden de minimis exemption, which was recently raised by Congress, and this affects shipments of $800 or less. They're allowed to come into the U.S. for or along the lines of duty free. So he's ending that for Chinese shipments, and that actually goes into effect on May 2nd. So in terms of what are the aims of some of these tariffs, we've talked about his goals to reduce trade deficits as a key a key concern of his. He wants to replace revenue, fund other priorities, perhaps. He said that he wants to reshore production over time, bring back manufacturing jobs, and things like that. I think it's important to the proposals in play, at least that we've seen to date, are estimated to be 15 to 20% or 20 times larger than those that we discussed during his first term and those that we really saw during his first term, right? So I think during his first term, he imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, solar imports, and washing machines, among maybe one or two others that I'm blanking on. But it was really only 4 instances that he imposed sweeping tariffs, despite threatening to impose tariffs many other times. Already in this term, we've seen him impose tariffs on a lot of goods. I think roughly close to 3 trillion. And so we're just in the first 100 days, and we're seeing many more tariffs, as well as the tariff proposals that he's considering just being much larger in scope. I always also like to say, there is a time and place for narrow strategic tariffs especially with respect to trade remedies, right? Anti-dumping, countervailing duties, things like that. National security related tariffs, for example, on Russian aluminum and uranium. And then obviously the special case of China. There are a lot of instances where it does make sense to impose tariffs on China. And so I do like to make sure that we cover that as well. But moving on again in more depth in terms of what's actually in force now, and pardon me if you've already covered this today, but first off the boat was really this Canada-Mexico threat related to the fentanyl migration crisis. And we saw 25% tariffs imposed on March 4th. And he ended up doing a couple of carve-outs, the first carve-out, the USMCA compliant carve-out, and then he also carved out some auto goods, but then hit them later on, and we'll get to that. So all in all, it's summed up to be about 1/3 of all imported goods are tariffed under this sort of proposal that's been enforced for a couple months now. China was a part of this initial fentanyl threat, right? You'll recall that it was Canada, Mexico, China that all needed to cooperate more and with the US and address the fentanyl crisis. That was sort of the first wave. China retaliated, so then he doubled it. We then saw tariffs on in other ways, whether it be steel, aluminum, autos, or this universal tariff that kind of all adds up to this 145. Plus many other sort of duties that were already in existence, as I said. So, China is near and clear his target here. But with respect to the steel and aluminum as well as the autos, I think a big expansion that's different than last time is this coverage of derivatives, right? So not only does it do these 25% tariffs cover primary steel and aluminum, they also cover derivative items. So grill netting, screws, door frames, things like that. And with the autos, that's just hugely expansive in terms of specifically the North American supply chain and the amount of trade that's impacting already and will impact. Auto parts, there's going to be a process that they'll be included starting May 3rd. So we'll have some more clarity on that later this week, hopefully, but it's still extremely sweeping. And then lastly, you had this reciprocal tariff announcement. This was the sort of Liberation Day announcement, and this was two-pronged, really. There was the first part, which was the 10% baseline tariff, the universal tariff that was imposed on April 5th, as well as a higher rate for countries on roughly 60 trading partners, which was going to take effect on April 9th. Ultimately, the higher rate, the reciprocal rate, was paused for 90 days, so until about July 9th, and that's what's causing all these countries to come talk to the US allegedly and see what they can do. Just for some more visuals regarding some of the rates and how they were calculated, the trade deficit divided by overall imports. You have rates kind of ranging the board here, 90% high on the high end, low percentage, 10% there. So it really kind of runs the gamut. USTR Ambassador Greer, USTR Ambassador Greer, earlier this month told senators during an annual trade hearing that a lot of these rates were tougher for the Southeast Asian countries and less tough for the Western Hemispheric countries, potentially as a way to promote nearshoring and things like that. But I think we're certainly still getting clarity into how they were developed and how they could move forward. In terms of historical context, this is just a helpful visual to understand how they compare, right? Historically, they are much, much larger than have ever been contemplated before here. And so that's kind of the reciprocal tariffs and the IEEPA tariffs, which were imposed under the International Emergency Powers Act. Regarding a lot of these national security tariffs, so again, the autos, steel, aluminum, and others, I'd just like to kind of outline the metric that we're dealing here. And again, this is just for the national security-based tariffs. We're looking at affected imports of roughly 1.3 trillion. And I say that because of all of these pending tariffs that could be coming on lumber and copper and otherwise here. So it's certainly a major sum that we're dealing with. It's the largest tax increase that Americans have faced in more than 50 years. I believe the speaker got into this a little bit as I was joining, but tariffs are a tax paid by Americans. They are paid by the company importing them. The company then decides how to pass that cost along in terms of which percentage of pass-through ultimately gets to the consumer. There's varying data, but ultimately predominating data that shows that nearly 100% of the cost is passed through to U.S. consumers, and this has led to predictions saying that U.S. households in general will be roughly $4,000 poorer, and so it's certainly something that is taking up earnings calls and voting polls and everything like that. Tariffs are now the top issue here for those who weren't previously thinking about it. Supply chain implications, we discussed this already a bit, but these supply chains are wildly complex and integrated, right? And so we make things together with our allies, and autos is a great example of the semiconductors, steel, aluminum, rubber, leather, just so many different kinds of materials going into this one finished product. And so it's a major blow to the complexity and the integration of these supply chains. Retaliation, we've seen some retaliation paused while these talks occur through July 9th. But by and large, the China has retaliated in kind. They've retaliated with their own 125% tariff rate, as well as a variety of export bans on critical minerals and other ways that they're deciding to retaliate on U.S. companies. So we've seen that already. We've seen different types of Canadian retaliation, and expect retaliation to continue depending on what happens in a couple of months here, based on how these talks go. In terms of what you can do, I always say that it's going to be important to get an understanding of your supply chains relevant to your businesses. So tier 1, tier 2 suppliers. The administration is keenly focused on stripping out Chinese content and ensuring that other countries are not, being used as a conduit for that content. So that's really kind of the purview that they're assessing a lot of this. Also just getting a better understanding of where your goods are coming from, where they're going, elevating the markets that you're doing in terms of allies versus foreign adversaries, things like that. And then emphasizing those increased cost impacts or other challenges or benefits that you're seeing. We haven't seen a lot, but if you are experiencing benefits, tell your members of Congress, associations, and otherwise. To date, we've really only been hearing about the cost impacts and other challenges, and that's what we expect to really kind of control the spotlight. But definitely just keep track and get involved, get smart. Not all tariffs are the same as we said, but these broad-based tariffs on a variety of goods are clearly having impacts. So I like to always end on this quote here, and it's a quote from Vivek Ramaswamy, that if we're really serious about decoupling from China, that actually means more, not less trade with key allies like Japan, South Korea, India, and otherwise. So that's how I always like to end a not so cheery presentation. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Isabelle. So we've definitely got a few questions for you that if you're okay, we'll just dive right into those. Is the U.S. Chamber concerned at all about a whipsaw precedent that is being potentially set where you have, I know we're only barely at 100 days or not quite at 100 days yet here, but eventually the presidency will turn over. Are you guys concerned about a whipsaw effect where presidents are just going to start to do this pendulum swinging with tariffs? Is that something you've thought about at the chamber?
Yeah, that's certainly, a major part of all of our arguments that we're making to Congress and otherwise is that this kind of environment is impossible or nearly impossible to do business in. This level of uncertainty is currently untenable for any kind of meaningful investment, or trade relationship to prosper. And that's certainly been a key focal point of our messaging to all leverage points, right? Unfortunately, I think there is precedent because of what President Trump did during his first term. But as I kind of hinted toward, this level of tariff activity is certainly amplified beyond what was done during his first 100 days.
And is there any developing or emerging consensus about folks in DC or among U.S. Chamber or the other organizations you work with closely about when we might see some of the uncertainty stabilize?
I'm not sure. I think a lot depends how these reciprocal negotiations kind of turn out, right? I think right now we don't have a lot of substantive detail about the kinds of outcomes that they will involve. But I think that the less countries want to trade with us and the more they want to trade with China, that's clearly going to be an effect, a potential effect if the administration keeps kind of turning countries away by these extremely steep and frankly insulting tariffs on key allies. I think that it's going to take time, but ultimately that's the trajectory that we're moving in at this juncture.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier. We had a question during our last speaker I want to revisit here. So setting tariffs aside and retaliatory tariffs aside, what are you guys hearing on the ground about some of the consumer retaliation that's coming more directly out of nationalism? So I'm thinking of Canada, for example. Apart from any new tariff or tariff discussion, they're having a reaction and just to other political conversations, and that's manifesting itself in goods not being bought or even returned in some cases for some Oregon companies and I'm sure others. What are you guys hearing there, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, that's kind of what we call one of the secondary effects, right? It's not a direct effect of imports having now a higher cost or U.S. exports being hit. It's a personal branding issue, right? Canadian consumers and otherwise are boycotting American products because of what's happening politically. And I would not be surprised if this starts cascading into other markets, right? Canada is just kind of the the first example that maybe the starkest example, because we are so close to them, and rightfully so. But you know, they've been booing the U.S. national anthem at NHL hockey games, right? I know that's kind of another example, but tourism is another example. You've seen all those reports that Canadians have canceled their annual trips to the US and to Florida and elsewhere to get away from the cold and things like that. So these are what we call secondary effects that are absolutely cascading throughout supply chains and throughout relationships writ large. You know, what happens again with Europe, for example. Europe approved billions dollars worth of retaliation just ahead of the reciprocal sort of Liberation Day announcement. They ended up pausing it a few hours. Trump announced his pause, but again, that is teed up and ready to go. And I think we can rest assured that if steep tariffs do move forward on an ally such as Brussels, we'll see similar sort of sentiments from Europeans across the globe.
Yeah, that makes sense. You talked a little bit about manufacturing, and we have a few questions that are all sort of related, so I'm going to probably inartfully try to combine them into one here. There's obviously been throughout this whole conversation a lot of discussion about bringing manufacturing home, about reshoring American manufacturing, and we know of companies here that are going to benefit if that does manifest. So again, this discussion doesn't affect all businesses equally. They're very differently situated. But there's two parts to this. I wonder if you can talk about with us for a second and what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is thinking as it relates to these. First is when you think about the relative time it takes to really make domestic reshoring or bringing manufacturing home. That's a costly capital endeavor, and it takes time to do that. So one is how does that square itself, the time it takes to bring stuff home versus the timing of this whole conversation. And then the second is whether we're going to have the workforce, and I know you don't know as much about Oregon, but are we going to have the workforce in America to handle that reshoring in American, if everything were to domesticate again?
I think these are really relevant and astute questions that a lot of other chambers are asking. And you know, you hit the nail on the head with respect to the workforce question. It's a question that I hope the administration is assessing. Do Americans want to work in factories if they are brought back here? Is that something that is there demand for that? Right? That's not something I can answer, but it's certainly something that I hope the administration is appropriately addressing. You know, with respect to the relative time or the time element, that's exactly right. Depending on the sector, it could take between 5 and 7 years to set up a factory. Take pharmaceuticals, for example, right? I mean, that's billions of dollars worth of capital R&D investment related capital and things like that, workforce aside, right? And so that's obviously a major time element. And in the meantime, you know, I think again, it's not that we disagree with onshoring writ large. That's not where we are. We just in general feel that nearshoring and friendshoring is what should be prioritized. It's what has been prioritized, and it's been prioritized for reasons, right? We have these major, reliable and deserving security and trading partners who have comparative advantages in making things that we aren't producing domestically, either because we can't because we don't want to, or we can't because we don't have the critical minerals or things like that. If it's like a mining issue, or there are a lot of different factors that go into these things. And I think in the short term, while the administration is focusing on bringing supply chains back, right? Maybe we won't say bringing manufacturing back. Maybe we'll say bringing supply chains back. In the meantime, or in the sort of short term, yeah, that's sort of the long-term goal. But in the short term, there needs to be a confluence of other incentives, investment incentives, as well as that short-term access to reliable inputs from trading partners, right? If we can't get a specialty steel for a certain type of machine that will power these or is a critical input for these factories, we need to be able to at least get it in the near term while we develop the know-how and understanding and general capabilities to do that, right? And so I think as you kind of alluded to, a lot of this is really centered around costs and sort of how these get squared short-term, long-term goals, which national security is paramount, but we need to address all of this cognitively.
Yeah, no, and I think you said it very well. And to be clear, I mean, I think OBI and our members, our partners in this webinar and the report that we just heard about, I think generally speaking, we want growth in manufacturing in whatever way we can make that work, and in the supply chain and logistics that lead up to that. And so you're absolutely right. This isn't to us a zero-sum game about doing things here or there. It's about doing them everywhere. And as a result, lifting up individual prosperity through the jobs, whether they're jobs that are in the manufacturing or in the R&D or in the supply chain manufacturing components, component parts or services, et cetera. So I think you also said it well when you said that these supply chains are wildly complicated and often developed over years, and there's multiple reasons that they exist, where and how they exist, resource availability, et cetera. So that's our concern is will there be so much short-term pain that we can't dig ourselves out of that hole, while are we also then taking our eye off the ball about how to have sustained long-term growth in a state like Oregon that is that we talked about a little bit ago with our previous guest, in a manufacturing recession, seeing some private sector job growth slow down compared to other states. We can't be taking our eye off that ball. We want to do what we can to grow holistically. So that's that. This is a really important point in time for our state economically. And so anything that sort of upends that apple cart even further is really difficult. So
Absolutely. And I think it's also critically important to, in addition to all of that we just talked about, is just how is the US perceived as a long-term ally, right? What is happening to our credibility and I think that's a question that needs to be elevated and prioritized throughout all of these onshoring conversations, right? Is how are we going to maintain our leadership as a credible partner? And I think some of that may be coming into question.
Yeah, great. We'll let you go, but any last words of advice on how our members and other businesses across Oregon can get involved in the conversation, stay up to date, et cetera?
No, I think, attending and holding seminars like this is a great first step. As I noted, get in touch with your members of Congress with respect to specific detailed anecdotes and cases about how these tariffs are impacting your businesses in particular. The more detailed, the better, just so that the administration can have an understanding of how their policies are impacting people outside of the Beltway, Americans outside of the Beltway.
Great. All right. And we, for those of you who may not know, on the OBI website, we actually have a federal resources page where we include information from the U.S. Chamber, the National Association of Manufacturers, National Retail Federation, and other partners. It also includes information on how to reach out to our U.S. senators, or to find information and reach out to our U.S. Members of the House. So please take a look at that, and Belinda can put that in the chat for everyone. So thank you very much to Isabelle and the team at the U.S. Chamber for joining today and going through that information, and we'll continue to provide updated info as we get it from them. So it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Tim DuRoche, Director of Programs for WorldOregon, who's going to lead us through our panel discussion for the remainder of this webinar. WorldOregon is probably familiar to many of you, but it's an organization whose mission is to broaden and deepen public awareness, engagement, and understanding of international affairs, connecting Oregonians with the world and with each other. Tim notes that his work, there is a platform for exploring issues that connect and define us, and I think this is a perfect example of one such issue among the business community and, frankly, communities and families across Oregon. Tim also notes that he loves when his work inspires an aha moment or a path to action for audiences and community members. So hopefully this conversation today will do just that and allow people to engage. And I'm so grateful that Tim has given us part of his afternoon today to lead us through this panel discussion, and I'll let him introduce the panelists. Thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Angela. So at WorldOregon, we have been spending a fair amount of time looking at the topics of trade, tariffs, and economic outlook with the new federal administration, including just prior to inauguration with the Council on Foreign Relations RealCon initiative. And then we followed that up with a presentation by Isabelle's colleague, John Murphy, in early March. Since then, it has been a veritable fast and furious bumper car ride through the start, stop, pause, freeze, begin again, flurry and chaos of executive orders and policy volleys around tariffs and trade that, while they may not give Oregonians all the answers, are most certainly causing seismic repercussions and anticipated pain to business, trade, and export for companies small, mid-sized, and large across this very trade-dependent state we call home, as Mike Wilkerson eloquently pointed out to us. So the new tariffs in place today, although I haven't read the news in the last 10 or 12 minutes, include, as Isabelle noted, the 145% tariff on goods from China, 25% on Canada and Mexico, along with 10% on all other countries, including those ruled by penguins, which amount in essence to the combined equivalent of a 26% sales tax on imported goods coming into Oregon. So then last week, Attorney General Dan Rayfield joined 11 other Democratic states attorneys general to challenge the president's authority to impose tariffs on nearly all imported goods. And here we are today. So I'm really honored to be here today with OBI and this esteemed panel to lift up the hood and discuss the challenges and opportunities for Oregon business and industry. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel. So joining us today, we have Sean Daoud, a native Oregonian, a second-generation recycler at Pacific Northwest Metal Recycling, Inc. He is the vice president and treasurer, a shareholder, and serves on Pacific Northwest Metal Recycling's board as a director. He's also the secretary treasurer of the Recycled Materials Association. Amanda Hoey is the CEO of both the Oregon Wheat Commission, that is our commodity commission, as well as the Oregon Wheat Growers League, which is the private growers association. Prior to this role, Amanda was the executive director of the Mid-Columbia Economic Development District. Welcome. Dr. Subramania Krishnakumar is the president and CEO of Siltronic Corporation, a Portland-based manufacturer specializing in hyper-pure silicon wafers. As a subsidiary of Siltronic AG, a German company with a global presence across Asia, Europe, and the US, Siltronic Corp and Krish understand the complexities and pressures of the current trade environment and its profound impact on global trade and domestic manufacturing. And Kari Mahe is the new CEO at Dobbes Family Winery / Wine by Joe. She's been with the company since 2015, beginning in the HR and accounting space, ultimately becoming general manager and now CEO. Kari also serves as vice president of the Oregon Wine Commission. And finally, Curtis Robinhold joining us again. He is the executive director of the Port of Portland, which operates 3 working marine terminals, 2 general aviation airports, and the Portland International Airport. Native Oregonian from Eugene, he has worked in and around policy for some time, having been an advisor to Congressman Peter DeFazio and chief of staff to Governor Kitzhaber, and as a former board chair and board of trustees member of WorldOregon. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here today with us. Let's start. We want to keep this a little informal. We don't just talking ahead. But so feel free to jump in where you see fit. But let's start, if not in a simpler time and perhaps, I don't know, maybe a more predictable time. And if each of you could give me a little bit of how the international trade sector has positively impacted your respective industries, specifically in terms of access to new markets and the diversification of supply chains. Let's start up in the corner with you, Sean.
Well, Tim, thanks, and appreciate OBI having me here as well. That's a good question. Our business, it's a family business, and the international markets allowed us to springboard and grow. We were selling products, about 10 or 15 years ago locally to other processors that had access to international markets, that owned steel mills in the Pacific Northwest. And in order for our business to grow, we had to decouple from those markets that we were selling to. And without having the ability to load containers, without now having the ability to load bulk ships, we wouldn't have been able to grow our business to where we are at today. And so those international markets have been extremely critical for our business, but also all the members that are represented on the West Coast of metal recyclers, because the domestic markets are extremely difficult to get to logistically speaking, and having the waterway access that we have out of Portland and the state of Oregon, which is considerably better than most other locations on the West Coast, gives a lot of businesses the ability to grow.
Right. Let's jump to Krish.
Yes. As the world has continued to, as we call it, digitalize, which is electronics has become such a intimate part of lives everywhere across the world. That's only helped our business grow. And so, before in 20, 30 years ago, the scope of intense electronics mainly stayed within the Western Hemisphere and probably the more developed economies. But today, all economies, large and small, consume electronics and are huge products of ultimately of what we supply. So we're thankful for that level of growth, because it's spurred innovation at the same time as it's spurred demand, and it's continuously helped in this industry becoming such a dominant player in world economies.
And Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I really do appreciate the inclusion of both agriculture and wheat in this panel and conversation, especially that interface on trade for rural communities that's been mentioned. So I would start with international trade is really a cornerstone for Oregon wheat. So 90+% of our product is exported, really given that unique position and access that we have to markets that are headed out through the Columbia River and then onto the Pacific Ocean before destination. So that's been the result for us of really decades of developing some strong relationships with buyers who are now consistently in our top 5 destinations, such as the Philippines and South Korea. Those ones began in some international aid environments and now in our top 1 and 2 market destinations with really loyal preferences for our wheat. And Japan, which will next year celebrate 70 years of an office in Tokyo that Oregon Wheat worked to establish, as well as some growth markets in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam coming up a close 6th in this market year. So we've done so with some really targeted investments over the years in market development and data and research that specializes in the wheat varieties and qualities that our customers are preferencing. So I would say wheat is not really unique in that. It's ag hitting really every corner of Oregon, and Oregon agriculture, our producers are growing products that are not only desired internationally, but also I think needed. So if I look at what our state produces in wheat on an annual basis, that's 45 to 50 million bushels, and that's enough wheat to meet the yearly caloric needs of 7.3 to 8 million people every single year. It's far beyond what Oregon needs to consume. We can only do that work in an export environment with open access and trade, and have really focused into that so that we can produce our products in the most sustainable manner, matching to our growing environment and remain a crucial part of the state economy.
Great. And Kari.
Yes. Thank you for having me here today. For the wine industry, I think that international trade is still largely untapped opportunity for us. However, I think that we still face significant challenges to pursue the global market. There are stricter labeling requirements, and then the potential for the increased tariffs create uncertainty around pricing and profitability, which make it hard to plan for sustainable growth. The uncertainty is often echoed by the brokers and partners who we work with, who are now taking kind of a cautious wait and see approach, which further slows international interest in our products. So given the current trade environment, it's not really a viable option for us, at least here. Adding to these challenges, Oregon is ranked the 48th business-friendly state out of 50 states. So every year with new taxes and regulations and programs introduced for the wine industry, such as now the extended producer responsibility requirements for businesses who have global revenue over $5 million, it just increases our operational burden. Oregon Pinot Noir is one of the most expensive grapes to produce, and you tack on high labor, compliance, taxes, laden costs, overhead, and competition in general. It even makes it more difficult competitively to sell our product. The continued unpredictability of what the Oregon legislature brings to the alcohol industry erodes confidence and makes it harder to justify investment, especially in the international market. So, international trade will remain difficult for us until the landscape changes.
So, Curtis, I wanted to end with you on this first question because each one of these other sectors intersects with where you're working. So what are you seeing in terms of where we have been, and what are you thinking about where we are going, what the biggest threat or challenges you're seeing just for yourself, but also for your neighbors in all these other industries?
Yeah, great. Well, I think you did hear from all four of the other panelists here about one of the things that's interesting to note. Amanda made this really good point about Asian markets. And if you think about wheat in Japan, it's a good example of traffic that really started 40 years ago for a very unique wheat that was desired in Japan, and a very high quality wheat. That started the flow of both product and people and culture and education, relationships. Those direct links, I think, are a really good representation of why trade is actually more than just a transaction. We've tried to replicate that direct link to Korea here in the past 15 or 20 years, and now we're seeing that market really grow. We think that's where we're targeting for the return of direct air service to Asia through Seoul. But that's also why you always see Mexico and Canada at the top of the trading partner list, is because you have access to those markets on road and rail. And so it's that direct service that's really interesting to us. And it gets a business like Sean, who mentioned containers, when he can get an existing service and target where his customers might be, whether it's in China or Korea, or a different method to get directly into those markets. That's where we really see value creation for Oregonians. It's why we don't talk about Belgium as a major trading partner. It's hard for us to get directly to Belgium, but Canada, Mexico, the Pacific Rim, that's a sweet spot for Oregon companies. And that extra value that Krish was talking about that you get from markets that might have a difference for Oregon manufacturers, that's really a sweet spot where we can get that value add that Mike Wilkerson was talking about and create really high quality jobs here at home.
So as Angela referenced, liking the aha, for me, Sean, you were the aha, I think, today, because most people don't think of recycling in the context of trade. And I'm wondering, it really is a far more complicated ecosystem than I think we understand it to be. So how much does metals recycling interplay with other markets, and including domestic manufacturing, and what are the threats you are seeing right now in terms of what you're doing?
Every single panelist that we have on here today, and probably every business that we have, attending this webinar, has metals that they need to recycle every day, right? You can think of the aluminum caps that go on top of a wine bottle. You can think of the grain silos that store wheat and other products. You can think of in the semiconductor industry, the silver, palladium, platinum, rhodium, all different, high precious metals that they use. Everybody has them, right? You go to the Port of Portland, the buildings with the rebar, the infrastructure, all the wire cabling, everything that's used for communications. Everyone uses metals every day. And so the recycling ecosystem, right, that we have that utilizes all these materials that we generate in our daily lives, a lot of people don't really understand that they create value. Every piece of material that we buy at PNW Metal Recycling, that most metal recyclers do business with, they pay for it because there's a value. Then they further cut, package, palletize, box, however you want to describe it, into no grade ready products that they can then sell for even more value. And so recyclers exist for a reason. It's to take these high valuable items out of the waste stream, right? And if it wasn't profitable to do so, people wouldn't spend the time keeping them out of their garbage cans or keeping them out of their waste bins at demolition sites, right? There's an industrial and there's a residential and commercial processes for recycling. The export markets, the tariffs that we have today, they don't exactly impact the ability that we can access those markets, but they impact the value. And so when we can't make as much money as we do selling the products into Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Korea, Japan, I can go on and naming more countries than just China, we're not going to be able to provide a higher value to the suppliers that we pay for these materials. And then when that value comes down, the impact that you'll see is costs being passed on to the consumer, right? Kari had mentioned EPR. That's another costly position where if they're not going to make as much money on the products that they keep out of the streams that they have to track, it's going to make it more expensive for the producers to pay into the system. And there's a whole host of things that come with these tariffs. And if they maintain the levels that they're at, if they maintain a very long period of time in place, we will see that impact happen shortly. In the long term. Short term, I don't know, these tariffs won't have as much of an impact because things will ebb and flow. People will and companies will be creative in how to move things around. But at some point, China is one of the biggest dominant factors in the metal recycling space. It having the largest tariff, I think that had been mentioned already, that's going to have a fairly large detrimental impact into the world if we can't find a way to coexist with them at some point in time. And they are the largest market for metals recycling as a whole, whether the raw material makes it to their facilities in China for production, or it's the subset products like ADC 12 ingot or a copper ingot or a steel a billet, an HRC hot rolled coil, whatever it might be. So these can, in the short term, not going to be as impactful, but in the long term, these can be pretty negatively impact our Oregonians and the businesses that reside in the state of Oregon.
So with an elevated rhetoric and a sort of a reversed course on climate policy and conservation, is there a worry about how that will trickle down to your industry?
Well, it already has. I think you could probably count on your hands and feet how many metal smelters, whether it be aluminum, steel mills, copper smelters, what have you, you can count on your hands and feet is how many businesses have closed in the last couple of decades that have been massively beneficial for the recyclers, for manufacturers in the Pacific Northwest. You can think of, I think Columbia Steel is an example of a long-term business that has helped metal recyclers in the area, has also helped the mining industry and other industries that use castings. We use castings and shredders all the time, right? They're the hammers, they're the liners, or the grates that we use for recycling process. And without cheaper access to those, now we're going into China. China is the biggest outlet for those castings. You can find them locally, or I shouldn't say locally, domestically, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, up in Canada, and some other more centrally located states that have access to manganese products. But for us, the freight differential between that and an export can is so high, and the manufacturing process cost is extremely high. So Columbia Steel was a great outlet. We don't have them anymore. So I think that's a pretty prime example of what the emissions and climate initiatives that state of Oregon have, right or wrong, doesn't matter your perspective on it, the negativity that it can have on other businesses when you have to start to increase the cost. And then you think about, the climate impact of having to bring those parts here via ship, the more negative impact of manufacturers in other countries, because in the United States, we are the cleanest producers of steel of any metal in the world. We're the best at it. And unfortunately, we don't do as much of it as we could. 30% of the ferrous products that we produce in the United States is exported. Only 70% is utilized. And much of that less usage of what we produce here every single year is from regulation, because companies cannot exist with environmental regulations they have to abide by.
So Krish, the tech sector, and specifically semiconductors, which we hear so often when we talk about Oregon economy, it's relatively more important to Oregon than in other states for a share of jobs and economic development and activity. As a global company in a very highly competitive and rapidly evolving sector, what is top of mind for you right now and on the horizon?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So, um, as demand growth has continued to persist in the semiconductor supply chain, we've been dealing with the last several years with a excess channel inventory condition that probably is not very apparent to most folks out there, and that's really coming out of the COVID and the post-COVID ramps that several of our channel inventories have various levels that are overstuffed. So for us, and specifically for Siltronic, it's being very agile, which is being able to pivot to markets which show growth and even sub-markets that show growth and other markets that are not showing growth, being able to work down the inventories on that. And so what really matters is a very smooth supply chain to do this, because it's very complicated. We rely on parts and products from various parts of the world. We source them, and then we create value from them, and then we ship them mostly to overseas markets. There's very little, not as much as it used to be 25, 30 years ago, domestic production. So what's on top of my mind is almost always the ability to be agile and the ability to be smooth in terms of being able to source and supply products everywhere in the world at the best, most competitive range possible.
So turning toward ag, which is always my other favorite aha, I think it tells so much about who we are and what we do and who our friends are. Kari and Amanda, we learned a little bit about the importance of trade to our agriculture and agricultural aligned industries from both Mike and Isabelle, but can you talk a little more about what is at stake for you and others in the sector right now? Whoever would like to jump in first.
Sure, I can jump in, and probably Kari will have some more prescient remarks following me. But I would say agricultural producers really have a lot on the line, and wheat probably even more so, just given our global position. The reality is that we have always operated on really thin margins for ag, and we come into this year with a combined challenge of the elevated input prices with depressed market prices. So our current uncertain environment really places pressure on both of those at a time when our producers don't really have a lot of room to give, as the price for a product is below the cost of production for many, and we're lacking some stability in a new farm bill. So I would say we as an organization did start on our new strategic plan in the last couple of weeks, and one of those things that comes up as a strength for us, which is that export market, is also one of our substantial threats in that export dependency, just because of how much we are then influenced by what happens with changes in policies. And we saw that with that recent Section 301 proposed actions regarding Chinese maritime practices. Some of those initial actions that were proposed to address a strategic threat to the U.S. would have also made us uncompetitive in product delivery. So we really rely on ocean-going vessels. When we calculated the projected increase in per metric tons for wheat, that would have brought us out of price range for our customers. So acknowledging, some of those final actions are still very complicated on a container side. USDR was responsive to some of our industry comments. It addressed some of the bulk issues. But in the interim, we did see a lot of the impact to our contracts, concerns from our overseas customers. So it gave us a flavor of what can happen in that uncertainty, even before something is finalized. So a lot of conversation, and today too is centering around tariffs, rightfully so. But I think the hard part is it's still a really big question mark for us in terms of how our main markets will respond.
You know, you hinted at this a little bit earlier, but I mean, there are a lot of policies that may not be directly related in terms of, trade and tariffs, but the slashing of humanitarian aid. Can you talk about the effect that that has had on ag and specifically on the wheat industry for you?
Yeah, and that one is another where still a little bit uncertain as to where it will end. We do, for Oregon, have provided quite a fair amount of commodity donation into Food for Peace programs. And so that is a program that actually delivers commodity to areas that need it. And Oregon has probably had an outsized role within some of that in terms of where the destinations have been for that product in the past. And it's one of those that until funding mechanisms are lined out is a really big uncertain in terms of a destination. But it would typically be within the top 10 areas for where we would be going in any individual year. So that adds another layer for our producers. And typically those donations would occur at a time of year where it was advantageous for us to be able to provide those, kind of level out some of our market uncertainties over the year.
So, Kari, wine is a smaller part of Oregon's trade picture often, even though it includes I think about 1,100 wineries statewide. But my hunch is it offers us a useful insight into how the tariffs are affecting the state. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what has been at stake for you in the industry and what's going on.
Yeah, obviously the tariffs are causing uncertainty. A lot of producers send product to Canada, whereas Canada is no longer taking any of our products. In fact, just for us alone, they still had some product on the shelf and they back charged us for whatever they destroyed. So I know that is impacting a lot of wineries right now that we're sending out internationally to Canada, and we don't know what that looks like in the future. The other thing that we're challenged right now with is the surplus of bulk wine and grapes in the market. A lot of wineries are cutting back on their inventory just because the demand is a little bit less than it used to be. There's a lot more competition out there, and it's just a little bit harder to sell wine than it used to be. One thing I've noticed is that 5 or 10 years ago, we were getting a lot of California producers coming to seeking Oregon Pinot Noir. And that trend has recently been declining. And I think that one of the contributing factors to that is a program called the Duty Drawback Program that is put on by the federal government. It eliminates an excise tax for certain importers. Basically, the importer pays duties on the foreign goods, such as bulk wine. Then they can get a refund if they later export a similar but maybe not identical product. The reason I talk about that is because instead of California coming to Oregon to look for high quality Pinot Noir, they're getting wine from overseas for a much cheaper price and for essentially no taxes because they're, sending wine back. In the past 6 years, the federal government paid out $204 million in subsidies tied to the imported wine. And in 2024 alone, more than 38 million gallons of low-cost foreign bulk wine entered into California. So, just having that surplus of grapes is really hurting the livelihood of our growers, which is the cornerstone of our industry. Because if we don't have grapes, then we don't have a winery or something to make a product out of. And so I think that is really putting the domestic market at a disadvantage.
Well, and so Amanda and Kari, both an adjacent policy that we're seeing, certainly amplified quite a bit is immigration policy. And are you seeing a big hit to seasonal workers and people who are harvesting your products?
Yeah. From the Oregon side, I know our workers are scared due to the fact that there is so much uncertainty about whether or not they are, going to be here tomorrow or not. We still have workers. It hasn't really impacted the Oregon market too much, but it could. It didn't when in 2018 and 19 when we had the same threat. We didn't see too much happen around here, but it really puts everybody kind of in a scared space to see what might happen versus what will happen.
Anything to add, Amanda?
I think Kari did a good job, and we are a little bit smaller in the labor needs when we come to the wheat industry, but still, face constraints. All of agriculture has challenges in the labor side and labor costs, and so any additional pressures on that put us in a difficult position, certainly.
So our friends at ECONorthwest and the U.S. Chamber have done some really great data work on looking at what we get from Canada about the relationship. And a lot of that is aerospace and aluminum. But the thing we often don't think about is natural gas. And I think that this is something, I know, Curtis, you could probably jump in on this. Krish, Sean, we are seeing that predominantly a lot of our natural gas is coming to us from Canada, and energy prices are on the rise. How does increasing pricing for natural gas impact your business and or other manufacturers or transportation and processors? And whoever wants to jump in first, please just have at it.
Maybe I'll explain from our company perspective. So for us, the where natural gas really affects is, believe it or not, in electricity prices, because the forward contract for electricity is very much pegged to changes in natural gas prices. So as long as, when we saw the diversion of liquid natural gas over to overseas, the natural gas prices in the U.S. Shot up, and clearly, it becomes because of power generation that happens with that, it lifted the power prices, and that directly affects our bottom line, because in our business, we power and the stability, having both power stability and at good cost is extremely important, because we consume a lot of power making silicon, and so that's a big component of it. So that's most directly where we see. I think we are seeing some. We had seen some underlying inputs that we get from our suppliers being affected by the natural gas prices, and thus certain suppliers, they raise the cost because they have to pay more for natural gas for generation of those gases and chemicals that they need to supply to us. So it affects us there too. So it's it's super important. Natural gas and overall energy prices, keeping them low, competitive, is very very important for the health of this industry.
I might just add on to Krish's comments there, Tim. Just that I think people don't really know that it's over 50% of Oregon's natural gas comes from Canada. It's a big number. And that's really, a lot of it is because of the structure of the pipelines and where we sit on that pipe grid. But I think this sort of thinking about the impact of this ripple effect that Krish was describing is that it's a lot of component parts. And I know it affects other companies that you might not think of. Sort of off the top of your head, you think, right, if you're Daimler and you're assembling large vehicles on Swan Island in the Portland metropolitan area, you get it. Some of your pieces are coming from Mexico and some from China. Some are going to be hit by aluminum and steel tariffs, and others by retaliatory tariffs. But one you might not think of, and I see he's on this call, that I heard from Trey Winthrop about. He's the CEO of Bob's Red Mill. We simply don't grow all the products that Bob's Red Mill sells. And so you have to get them here to assemble them and package them up and send them somewhere else and create that margin. So, it's not just commodities, it's a lot of other unique elements that go into that value add that we were talking about earlier in Oregon, is what makes this place really special. We have talented people that add value to these products. Some of them are ag and some of them are not, but that ripple effect will really fall through a lot of different types of business around the state, not just a big metals manufacturer in in downtown Portland.
Sean, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, Curtis had kind of mentioned, when you don't think about something in the metal recycling industry, just, I mean, really any industry that might create a VOC, a volatile organic, through the manufacturing process, right? They will use something called an RTO, or regenerative thermal oxidizer. Well, that's just like a giant oven. Those ovens are powered by natural gas, right? And what they do is that they, those emissions are harnessed, right, from a suction tube, and they go into the RTO and they get burned off. And so that RTO is getting so hot that it burns the VOCs, and it needs natural gas to be able to do that. Well, that creates cleaner air. It helps, manage, any of these CO2 emissions or VOC emissions that we create as manufacturers. And now we're going to be making it more expensive for our companies to manage their environmental impacts. Now, probably going to still do it, right? But at the end of the day, how much of it are they going to do? Are they going to do less because it's now more expensive, right? Are they going to try to, reduce their expenses, and unfortunately maybe reduce their economies of scale because they can't ebb and flow with volume. It is, and if they do ebb and flow with volume, and they need to increase production, right? Because they have to make up for it on more volume out. Can they even have the market to do it? So it is, you're talking about higher energy prices. You talk about, higher tariffs, access to markets, devaluation of things. I mean, you're just inevitably, it'll constrain you, full circle here. And at some point, where do you find your exit to be able to, get back into the, profitability territory?
So I think you're all pointing out something that is, when you move beyond the sort of widget 19th century mercantilist frame of mind. Eric Beinhocker recently in the New York Times mentioned we don't really have an American economy because of the complexity of components and deliverables. We have an American ecosystem, and that one can't just simply focus on one thing because it hobbles the rest of everything. Curtis, speaking of businesses and complexities, the Port of Portland is one of the gateways to the world of Oregon business. What are you hearing from your customers, from colleagues, and more specifically from your international partners?
Oh, that's great. I think what we're hearing from our partners, you've heard a nice snapshot of here, Tim. I maybe just add a few things. One, the uncertainty really is just crushing. And that sort of moving around a lot. I think, I don't want to speak for everyone here, but I would say, you look at a 10% tariff that you can plan on and you think it's going to stick, you can adjust your model for a 10% tariff. It's not knowing if the 10% tariff is going to be there in 2 months or not that is really destructive and really complicated. I was struck that Isabelle described essentially, if you're, I should say, as a caveat here, I actually do think there are some good reasons for some of the 301 tariff conversations. Those are the part of the Trade Policy Act that deal with specific complaints about, in this case, China. The challenge is, do you go and do battle with China by first sticking all your friends in the eye with a sharp poker, or do you do battle arm in arm with your trading partners? And I do think resetting our relationship with Mexico and Canada and with Korea and Japan and with the EU and the UK, that makes a ton of sense if you really want to do something about how our relationship with China has advanced. So we're hearing some of that. I'd say just on the shipping side, we are hearing, in particular, our primary carrier here is SM Lines out of Korea. They are not directly affected. They don't have Chinese vessels. So we were deeply concerned that our connectivity would be really put off by a large number of Chinese vessels that would get hit by this very unique 301 complaint. We are not seeing that. What we are seeing on the whole West Coast, and my colleague down at LA Long Beach, Mario Codera, he runs the Port of Long Beach. He's saying they're seeing their forward view is now decreasing. They're seeing sort of a depression of what is coming for bookings this summer. And you can see that as well in the Wall Street Journal or the Journal of Commerce. I think what you're beginning to see is these costs being passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices. And as noted earlier by Mike Wilkerson, the effects are regressive. They hit lower incomes more. But what that does to businesses is these higher prices lead eventually to inflation and economic uncertainty. And I think that is really that question about how decisions are being made by people on this call, people that are listening as well, is you have to start thinking about your spending, and that will affect consumer spending. So some of the things we are expecting and we're seeing in aviation, for example, is a softening of travel and tourism because people are not sure what September's going to look like. Can I go on a nice summer holiday, or do I need to hold back a little bit? Businesses have to make those same decisions. So maybe just circling up as a point at the end of this answer to the question, it does mean one of the things we can do in Oregon is focus on creating an environment that, one, is reliable for business, is not an exceptionally bad environment to do business in, and two, that we have the infrastructure in place to connect to markets. And those are two things that certainly we're in dialogue with our statewide elected officials and with the Oregon legislature about, is help work on that business environment. And two, make sure you have the infrastructure to connect Oregon businesses when they want to connect and when they're ready. Those are two things certainly we hear from folks about. Is certainty would help. Making sure we have that connective fiber is another thing to focus on.
So Mike Wilkerson mentioned this, and it's not really part of this panel, but I do believe it is more than an undercurrent, and that is the question of tourism. The food we grow, the wine we produce, the industries that support the talent that comes here, that contributes to the quality of life, the ethos of renewal and recyclables, all these things make us who we are. And now that the weather is turning nice, I'm looking at what the effects on tourism are going to be. What are you seeing? We'll start with Curtis. Let's talk to everybody, but what are you seeing now at the port? What are we seeing for wineries, for restaurants, for hospitality? And what are you fearing will happen as this continues or accelerates?
We have not seen, we don't do forward bookings like the airlines do. So I can only tell you sort of as of today, we've not seen a big drop off as of today, but tourism travel, there's a lot in the winter around beach travel to Mexico, to warmer destinations. Our forward look is softening when we talk to our partners about bookings into the future. Tourism is not, most of what we've been talking about today is in the goods category, where tourism is like education dollars. They're in the services category, and Oregon also runs a surplus in the services category. So it's consulting, but it's also visitors coming here and spending dollars that are not for a good that you can hold in your hand. So we think that is around 35 or 40,000 jobs on that service export economy, really important employer. And, we're nervous. We're nervous about the forward look. I actually just met with one of our airline partners this morning. One of their execs is in town, and she was saying, yeah, we're starting to see leveling off. And that is just, they're seeing reflected this tourism nervousness when you're not sure what your financial situation is going to look like 6 months from now. You just don't book a big family trip. And I think everybody knows what that's like on a personal basis and on a, you can imagine on a business basis. That's very similar decision making.
Well, and I think the inbound and the outbound is, I'm certainly looking at this of like, where's my next trip going to be and where will the dollar go? Other folks, Kari, what are you seeing with wine and tastings and culinary tourism?
Sure. We're seeing a decline in traffic every year, year over year. I think people are nervous. One of the first things to go, wine is a luxury product, right? Tourism, traveling is all a luxury item. So it's the first thing to go when people are nervous about where their paychecks are coming from, or, how much food is going to cost. So yeah, we've continued to see a decline in traffic here, particularly at our winery. I know that the wineries around us are also feeling that. I do know that the Oregon Wine Board and the Willamette Valley Wineries Association are really trying to, and the local associations are really trying to do a good job of marketing, bringing people here for an experience, and finding ways to not make it cost so much for people just to enjoy our product.
Anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, I do want to remind our audience, please ask some questions of these very, very smart folks. Put your question into the Q&A box on your Hollywood Squares screen. We've been talking a lot about worries and concerns, so now we've gotten to the other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how is the show question? What opportunities do you actually see on the horizon with respect to trade and industry and potential? I mean, it can't all be woe and doom.
Well, I can start with, where this is where we started, where we end, right? Is kind of the full circle on this question. And as we look forward, despite uncertainties in the current environment, there are always markets where we are actively working to build those and to grow those relationships. So not just the retention on the stable ones that we have had over the last few years, but also where there is potential for our product to have value in expanding markets. So two of those for us recently in the fall, we visited our lab down in Santiago to meet with our U.S. wheat technical staff and our millers and customers. And as a result, this year, the Oregon Wheat Commission invested in some new equipment there that will allow us to promote our wheat for increased uses specifically in those markets. And the other one, similarly, where we're seeing some additional growth additional growth potential, both is in Southeast Asia. And we spent the last month there, including celebrating the launch of a new extended shelf life baking course at a baking school where we've had a 35-year investment to collaborate with users of our wheat to derive more value. So I think there are still ways in which we are working and seeking from the private industry and to continue to build those relationships, keep our reputation as a reliable supplier despite the uncertainties that are thrown at us.
Great.
It's really hard to find the positive and the negative, right? Especially when you're doing quite a bit of it with a lot of the unknowns that we all as business leaders have to deal with as of late. There's one thing that kind of comes to mind that we've been trying to focus on at PNW is how do we stay nimble? How do we, keep our ability to pivot? And, we've been lucky enough in the last couple of months that, we've been able to pivot to certain directions and maintain, sales options and sales routes while not losing too much value chain or value, I guess, in the logistics chains that we've been pivoting to. It's very difficult, right? You can't move as much volume because, again, there's already, natural flows of materials going to the areas that we've been trying to go to domestically. Our natural home is the Asian market. But when you're able to pivot, you can see how nimble your business is. You can learn about the systems that you need to put in place. You can learn how you need to, train and grow your team. You can look at how your recovery percentages in the metal recycling space. Your ultimate goal is to recover as much metal as you can from the stream of product you get. So you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about your systems in really tough times, and you're able to grow from these opportunities. The other kind of interesting thing too that I think we've done over the last decade or so is we've tried to pivot away from China. I think we've all been kind of talking a lot about China. And in the metal recycling space, we've gone through Green Fence, we've gone through Green Sword, we've gone through a whole host of different environmental iterations of what China has been trying to do. And a lot of the products that we sell, as I mentioned earlier, are going to other countries now, right? Now, again, inevitably, some of the stuff's still entering China, or it's coming back to the States, or going to Japan, or South Korea, other places. But that's another thing that you can do in these situations is to find new markets, right, where they're not going to be as impacted by the tariffs. And again, try to maintain that value stream. So these, while it's really difficult and it's going to require you to roll up your sleeves and get dirty and maybe spend a little bit of money trying to find these homes and trying to find the improvements, there's definitely always a diamond in the rough.
Anyone else?
I'll jump in. I really want to echo what Sean just said. That really hits home. We've had to really make a lot of changes here at our winery. Just to be flat and to look for growth. And I think that being nimble and looking for opportunities, like you can't keep doing the same thing and expecting the same result. And so I think, looking for small opportunities can grow into bigger opportunities. And so just like, just really having a great team that you collaborate well with, and always having smart people around you will really help you. Like for us, I don't know that, growth is really for us specifically as a company, like a lot of growth in our future, until Oregon decides that it wants to become a little bit more business friendly. So yeah, we're just, we're doing the same thing, just trying to find ways to be more creative.
In the tech industry, for us, beyond the short term, when we look at the mid and the long term, of course, what's really exciting us is the growth in artificial intelligence, and especially the artificial intelligence servers, because the complexity of those is significant, and the amount of silicon that goes into that is tenfold compared to what the historical servers. So we look at that as a sort of a bellwether for us to really grow our industry, the demand, and what we're excited about it is what it's going to be, how integrated it's going to become into our everyday lives, and it's going to, especially when we talk about the application layers within that, I think it's going to become so ubiquitous into things that we normally do, which is essentially a growth business for us, because that's new markets, new opportunities that our customers will be developing products for, that we'll be supporting for that. In the near term, I would say the short term, the electric vehicle market has been a bit of a disappointment in the recent, but we think that it's still a positive trajectory, and not just, but the entire automotive electronics that continues to be driving. So we're excited about some, basically, we're excited about some key areas where we believe our industry is going to focus on and grow, and we hope that rising tide to take us along with that, along with several of our other companies into that growing space.
And Curtis, what are you excited about? Are we going to get direct flights to El Salvador and Belarus?
Maybe as a side note, our job is to try to get one big connection into each of the markets, and from that place you'd get spread into that market. But I would say the thing that I'm optimistic about is that this has helped us see each other more. Folks are picking up the phone and talking to each other about trade. There's sort of an increased recognition about how these jobs are better jobs. And honestly, Oregonians are good at this. We've been good at this for a long time. We can adjust and be nimble. And I think, if anything, it's inspirational to say, hey, pick up the phone, call the people that are working on these things. The governor has been really engaged on making sure we have the infrastructure in place. State treasurer and the attorney general both thinking about what can I do to help push this along. Those are really good signs. We've got some great state legislators. Daniel Wynn on economic development on the House side has been super engaged on, can we connect better with markets in Asia? So, I think this is a rough time. It's hard to put a shine on it, but I do think we can get through it. And when the changes settle down after this period, I think we've got a 90-day window here where the administration is really trying to get a lot of either bilateral or multilateral conversations happening. We could see a settle in the fall, and hopefully we'll be newly aware of needing to create opportunities and infrastructure and reliability for Oregonians to connect to market.
So Emma Ashford in Foreign Policy this week was writing about the administration and said they seem to have been proceeding from a move fast to break things ethos, and the only consistent thing was the consistency of the chaos. But I'm curious, for each of you as leaders, what are you learning about yourself as leaders in this moment, and how are you bringing that inspiration back to your employees? I know that making sure that morale and focus on innovation and collaboration is such a key thing for Oregonians. And I'm trying to build on a question which I didn't quite understand, but it is how each of you are reacting at a high level to the current situation.
I think maybe I'll start with the answer on this. I firmly believe that what we need to focus on what we can control, and there are many things we can control within how we execute within our own organization. Responding, as I mentioned, about customers pivot to new products and they want solutions from us quickly and creatively, and so addressing that, being responsive to that in any market is super important, and even at this market, it's even more. So focusing on, making sure the customers' requirements and needs are not just satisfied but thrilled is most important for us. And then it's continuing to keep working on our organization, developing them, training them, and building on their innovative strengths and finding better, faster, cheaper solutions to problems. I think those are areas we can focus on. We can deal with that right now, and that's only going to make us better in any market cycle. That's the message that I'm trying to communicate internally.
Great.
Krish really kind of hit the nail on the head on something, and and for me, just on a personal note, right, through this kind of a weird time, and just in the last couple of years, the metal recycling industry hasn't necessarily been the healthiest of industries in the world, and I've been looking more to senior leadership of our company. What obviously I'm a part of, but my father, who's one of our founders and our president CEO, and looking at some other members of the industry, asking what have you done in the past when you've hit some of these times, right? I think that the saying that goes that history repeats itself is very true. It may not repeat itself in its same form, but it's maybe going to repeat itself in its same echoing of reason. And one big thing that I heard from a local recycler who's been in the industry for a very long time and basically said, I'm just a metal trader. I just keep trading things, and I keep my margin, I keep calm, and I keep steady. And as long as I do that, the business will stay firm. And he's done it for decades, and his business is pretty successful, I would argue and say. And I think that's just one of the things to where if you overreact too fast, from what I've heard and what I've learned over the years, and I'm sure as many as people on this call, you could shoot yourself in the foot. But if you don't react, when you need to react, right, that's the other thing. So it's finding the balancing act of when and how to know to pull that trigger.
And I think how we respond in that definitely does matter. In terms of the agricultural side, we've weathered a lot of storms, and not just in relation to in terms of current uncertainties, but it seems like every year for our producers brings something really substantial that's outside of our control. And so what we focus on in terms of that long-term vision, trying to keep that steadiness and that approach, reinforcing as we talk with our boards and our leadership about the direction that we're headed, so that we can manage through some of those challenges. It's applicable to this situation as well when we look at the uncertainties for trade. So we'll be celebrating 100 years of Oregon wheat next year, and I think our past leaders have definitely given that steadiness and approach that hopefully will continue to bring forward, regardless of any outside forces.
And Kari.
Yeah, for me, as a newer leader in this company, my philosophy is to listen and collaborate with my team, and we make decisions together. Since there's so many ways to look at this business from so many different perspectives, and while we don't want to react quickly, we want to react strategically and in a way that is not too slow to respond to the ever-changing landscape of the wine industry. And so for me, I just listen, stay calm, and I don't pretend to know what I don't know. So, and I think that really, you know, keeps the team motivated in moving forward and figuring out solutions together.
We can all lift a glass to that. And Curtis, I want to give you
Yeah, not a lot to add. Great comments. I think for me, the one thing that's really struck me in the last 3 or so months in this topic in particular is how good our people are at the port. And so I've just really enjoyed that our team really likes to get in and try to help our partners and to connect with partners and to not just sit back and relax. And that has been a ton of fun for me, just to see especially some newer folks get involved in these questions and engage. That's very rewarding.
That's great. So we're at time. I want to thank Krish, Amanda, Sean, Kari, Curtis, and of course, Angela for bringing everyone around the table, virtual or not. It's a great conversation. One of the things I love so much about doing these kind of conversations in the state of Oregon, and I've been at WorldOregon now for 15 years doing them, is there are always good ideas. There are big hearts and open ears. And even when we get, you know, as Amanda was saying, you know, we weather storms, and we are really good at, as our motto is this year on our 75th anniversary, we're really good at figuring out how to be better together. So I want to just thank all of you, and keep doing what you're doing. So we need it. We need each other, and stay safe and be well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone on the panel. I'll echo what Tim said. This was very insightful and informative, and there are thousands of stories like yours across Oregon. We certainly couldn't put together a panel with all affected industries and sectors. It would be too large, but thank you for representing our state and its diverse industries well. I also want to echo something that you all alluded to there at the end, which is something we're reminding folks of every day, which is businesses exist to innovate and solve problems and meet the needs of customers and clients. And so it's extraordinary to see that resilience manifesting in this time, in this issue, in this space as well. But you are, of course, all still doing what you do best, which is engaging in your line of work and, again, solving those problems for your clients and customers. So where do we go from here? First, please continue to share your questions, thoughts, and concerns with OBI or other organizations so that we know how best to serve and represent you. We'll take feedback from today and from other conversations and incorporate that into the DC fly-in that I mentioned next week, hosted by the Portland Metro Chamber. So thank you for giving us some timely input to give to our federal leaders and policymakers. We're also going to continue to educate elected and appointed policymakers on the nuances of business operations and how trade impacts those: supply chains and logistics, marketing, pricing, inventory management, manufacturing, wholesale and retail distribution, not to mention legal and regulatory compliance, and a whole bunch more. And importantly, we also are going to continue to remind those policymakers that trade is an important topic, but it's not the only topic. There are so many state level issues that Oregon's leaders need to remain focused on, opportunities to seize and challenges to address. So it's imperative that we do everything we can to restore our state's competitiveness across those policy areas so that our industry sectors can remain competitive and our companies can be well positioned as the dust from this conversation settles, however much dust it may be and wherever it may settle. So thank you again to our speakers and panelists, Mike Wilkerson, Isabelle Icso, Tim DuRoche, Curtis Robinhold, Amanda Hoey, Sean Daoud, Kari, Mahe, and Subramania Krishnakumar. Thank you to our event partners, the Port of Portland and Portland Metro Chamber, and thanks to all of you for attending. We'll get this recording posted online so you can share it with your networks. We appreciate everything you do to support OBI and our partner organizations, and most importantly, everything you do to create a healthy, prosperous, and competitive Oregon. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.